So I've been in the trenches in all of this. Last year, as I was traveling, a lot of people asked me if I was going to go back to the classroom, and they kind of would say, "Are you going back to the classroom?" And I finally got a little frustrated, and I said, "No, I am going forward to my classroom." And so I've been going forward this semester to my classroom, and I will tell you, it is as tough for me today as it was before. It is as tough for me as it is for all of you, because no day is the same, right? The kids are not the same, and I am too working to make sense of this core, right? I am too working to make sense of it. And thank goodness I have amazing colleagues to help us all make sense of it. So one of the things that I've had to do is really rethink my habits. You know, I think we end up with a lot of habits in our classrooms. We just do them this way because we've always done them. And so one of the ways that I started was to start with the anchor standards and look at those and try to figure out what they meant. Two of my colleagues, Kate Lechtenberg and Wendy Arch, had a brilliant idea last spring where they decided that what we should do as a department is to go through and summarize this work. So we would take these standards and we would summarize them into language that was a little bit more precise, because although I understand this, I can't teach from that many words, right? I can't teach from that many words. My brain does not hold that many words, right, on a given day. So we had to figure out what is it that we can really hang on to. And then we looked very specifically at the standards, at the descriptions, and we started to figure out what kinds of tasks could we do. And I was really reminded about a shift in my teaching that occurred several years ago. I used to think that I taught thematically, right? I would have a theme that we would talk about. So when we would read To Kill a Mockingbird, we'd spend time, we'd figure out what the themes in To Kill a Mockingbird were, and we would analyze them and discuss them. And then I kind of realized that was picking out the themes in To Kill a Mockingbird, but to really think and read and teach conceptually meant that I was going to have to start from a different place. And so one of the shifts for me, one of the changes in my own habits, was to go from pulling out concepts to starting with a concept. So I'm not teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, right? I'm teaching courage. And To Kill a Mockingbird is one of many texts that we are using in order to come to terms with what it means to be courageous. In addition to that, I think that the core creates constraint for us. When we look at all of those things that we are supposed to cover, if we think we're going to discreetly do that, we're going to drive ourselves crazy, right? We have to figure out how these things connect, right, where they overlap. My friend John Golden would definitely say that he would love to see more attention to visual literacy in the Common Core State Standards. I think that there are other people who would say, I want to hear more language about poetry. I want to hear more language about imaginative writing. So there are places in the core that we know have important fixtures in our classrooms, right? We need to kind of fill those holes and fill those gaps. So what this has meant for me is not to give up visual literacy. It's meant that I need to figure out how to marry the visual literacy with some of these other standards. And what happens is, in that process, I really become more innovative. So one of the things that I just was working on last week, I teach a course called Reading the Screen. It's a film study course, but it's really a course about how to read. That's really what it's a course about. And one of the things that I needed to do was I needed to have students compare some texts. And we have been spending so much time with film, I kind of had this little anxiety. I thought, well, how am I going to get students to look at all of this literature and all of these films? And then I started to think about what it could look like if we find ways for them to intersect. So instead of keeping these all separate, we started by reading Peter Pan, then we went to analyzing adaptations of Peter Pan, then we talked about growing up and used that theme of growing up as our umbrella. Then we looked at poetry that had to do with growing up. And once those students made sense of those poems, they put them into storyboards, and they adapted those poems into visual mediums. So we kind of went full circle, right? And there are lots of components of the core that we were able to cover in those couple of weeks. So I think innovation through constraint can happen for us. I think if we spiral our instruction, if we teach for transfer, we're going to see how important that is. We're going to see how this work can be done. And the other thing that's really wonderful about the core, I'll tell you, is that there's some pressure that can be taken off collegial conversations. So I don't know if this has ever happened to any of you where maybe you've had a different kind of frame of reference or a different sense of pedagogy than one of your colleagues, and it seems like the only way to resolve that is to talk about what you disagree in each other, right? When you have the core to talk about, you don't have to disagree with each other, right? You get to frame those conversations around the core itself, and I do think that that's helpful. If we can find focus, in what we do, I think that we are able to find understanding. So it wasn't too long ago I was looking at Newsweek. What was this, late this summer? You know how Newsweek always publishes the top 100 schools in the country? And I was looking at it, and I teach in a public high school, charter school, magnet school, charter school, and I started thinking, oh my gosh, where are the public schools? And I was getting a little bit frustrated, and then I kind of stepped back and I thought, you know, actually I know a lot more about a lot of these schools than I did a year ago, because I've been to some of them and I've met teachers who teach in these places, and they are really wonderful places. But you know what's wonderful about them? What's wonderful about them is they have a singular focus. They are the school of technology, right? They are the school of arts and sciences. They are, you know, and even in public schools that are functioning really well, it's that they have a singular focus. And they know, everyone knows that by doing something very deeply, you can't help but bringing in everything else, right? So when we think about the core, when you think about designing a lesson or a unit or even a course, right, or even a series of courses in your school, think about the focus that we can use to keep that, I think, intact. So in the classroom, again, I'm trying to make sense of the core all of the time. One of my newest personal challenges has been to take from the core the notion that when students are reading or writing, especially when they're communicating, that they should be solving a problem or asking a question. And so every time I have students in a group, I'm asking them to solve a problem or to answer a question, right? Instead of just having them get into the group and they've all read this book, right? And to have them go around, and you know how this works. Even if you have great roles for them to do, they all go around and they summarize, and they're all of these little mini reports, and they're not really talking, they're not really digging into the book. They're not having those kinds of conversations that people at this conference are going to have about their favorite books, right? So instead, I started putting a question or a problem in front of them. And then they had to use their texts in order to solve that problem together. It's a really small shift, but it's had a big impact. It's had a big impact on how I think about every day. Because when I think about what kind of problem am I going to ask them to solve, or what kind of question am I going to pose for them, I'm not thinking about tasks. You know what I'm thinking about? I'm thinking about learning. I'm thinking about what is it that I want them to learn. In the NCTE has published a book series on the Common Core State Standards. And in the secondary one, one of the things that you'll find is this notion of reading circles. And this is not like literature circles. It's a way of thinking about how we organize and design units of study. And how we organize and design those units of study have something to do with starting with a fulcrum text, okay, the text that we most want to make sense of. And then before that, though, we figure out what kinds of texts are going to offer context. And then in addition to that, what kinds of texts are going to create texture. This idea embraces that notion of texts in conversation with each other, not in isolation. Right? So how do we design those units? One of the things we know is that we can't do it if we don't start with a theme or an essential question. So I'm imagining those first steps right now. What are those first steps going to be like? Well, the first thing is that you have to know that everybody gets their own entry point, right? Everybody gets to come to this work on their terms. And what we are responsible for is finding that entry point. The other thing I have to tell you that I do, and I would maybe invite you to do this too, but I have to resist, whenever I come into contact with something new, I have to resist the idea that I'm already doing this, right? Because I'll tell you what happens in my brain. I don't know if this is what happens in yours, but in my brain, when I learn something new and I think, I'm already doing this. And if I go into compliance mode, right? I go into, all right, I'm going to prove all of the ways I am already doing this so that I don't have to think about it anymore, right? That's really different than coming to something and saying, oh, I have an anchor example of this in my practice. I can see in my practice this is where I'm going to start to come to understanding about this new idea. And I think that that's a fair way to approach the Common Core State Standards. I also think that we have to be careful about the notion of precluding mistakes. Sometimes we try so hard to make sure that everything is laid out so perfectly that nobody is going to make a single mistake. But I think that really impedes progress. I think it creates what Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry call task dependency. It sounds kind of like a, some kind of issue, right? Task dependency. But I think we've got a little bit of that in our culture in this country, right? We are dependent on tasks instead of being dependent on learning. And I know that when I look out here at all of you, and I know that you are having some time away from your students, but I'm pretty sure that you still have some of those students in the forefront of your mind, that you are thinking about not what am I going to ask them to do, but how am I going to ask them to learn.